Hello everyone, this is a video as part of the series on the first section of the text of A Christmas Carol. This particular video is going to focus on the 4 paragraphs that you can see on the screen right now. I'm not going to read it again. If you want to hear the sort of text being read, then go to the first video, as that's the best way to get it. Let's look at the language firstly. The first 4 paragraphs that you can see on the screen are all about Marley. So the text begins with Marley. Dickens begins the text with Marley. And we have a particularly famous opening line. Marley was dead, to begin with. And you'll see that I've highlighted the colon creating this dramatic pause. Colons also create statements. So Marley was dead, to begin with. And right at the very beginning of the text, Dickens creates an enigma, a mystery. The reader should be thinking, dead to begin with? Once you're dead, you're dead. How is it that you're only dead to begin with? Oh dear. And so given that we know the chapter, the Stave, is called Marley's Ghost, that colon does a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of work in establishing the ghostliness of Marley's character. The next key to notice about this text is that we have a third person narrator. And we can see that in the rest of the first paragraph. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk. So we don't have the perspective of Scrooge. We don't have the story from the perspective of Marley. But nor is the perspective that of Dickens. This is the perspective of a sort of separate third person narrator, perhaps an omniscient one. Omniscient being to know everything, to sort of see everything, and have the power of knowledge. Perhaps that omniscient narrator who is telling us this story. And we should notice as we read the text that the narrator is often jovial. Jokey is what that means. Jovial, jocular. There's a kind of light-hearted nature to it, which at some stages can be seen to undermine the kind of ghostliness and the terror of what Scrooge feels, but at other times accentuates the terror. More than anything, the narrator here is providing us, the reader, with an overview and a message. Typically throughout the text, that's going to be that Scrooge is the character who needs to go through a period of moral transformation. He needs to redeem himself. So the first paragraph, just to return to that, what does it tell us? That Marley was definitely dead, and Marley was definitely dead because the clergyman signed the docket, as did the clerk, as did the undertaker. Scrooge signed it, and we're told about Scrooge here that his name was good upon change, meaning if he put his name to it, then it definitely happened. The kind of whimsical nature of the narration is reinforced through this second paragraph, because what we have here is essentially a discussion of a simile, dead as a doornail. What does the narrator say? The narrator says, I don't really know why a doornail is dead, but it is dead. The narrator says here that they would have regarded a coffin nail as the deadest piece of iron that you could get. But, he says, the wisdom is in the simile. And therefore he will repeat that Marley is dead as a doornail. Many of you will have noticed that in the phrase dead as a doornail we have alliterative D's. So what? They are alliterative. I'm pausing here just to make a brief point that alliteration generally doesn't do a huge amount other than emphasize the tone that is already in the text. So because of the light-hearted, jovial, jocular nature of the narration, the alliteration reinforces that sense of this being humorous, or an underlying tone of humour. The third paragraph. Scrooge knew he was dead? Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? And then we're told about the relationship between Scrooge and Marley. So we're told that Scrooge was his sole executor. his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend and sole mourner. So the repetition there of sole is telling us that Scrooge and Marley had only each other. Theirs is a life of isolation and emptiness. And that's so important because this is establishing the character of Scrooge at the beginning of the text. Because if Marley is dead, then Scrooge is on his own. He is an isolated, solitary man who lives a life cut off from the rest of society. And then the third paragraph concludes by saying that Scrooge was not even very sad. He wasn't cut up. That's quite informal a phrase in some respects. But he was not so dreadfully cut up. He wasn't devastated. If anything, we're told Scrooge was an excellent man of business. And he got the funeral for a deal. So funerals have to be paid for. They are expensive. Scrooge got a bargain. And it's the bargain that brings Scrooge some joy. So, what are we being told here about Scrooge? He's on his own, but the thing that he is most pleased with is the getting it for a cheap price. So Dickens constructs Scrooge to be miserly and mean and uncharitable through his attitude towards the death of his partner. And the word partner typically tells us, usually means that, that you're together, that you're part of a community, you're part of a communal bond. There's something joining you. And for Scrooge, that isn't the case. So the text begins with Marley, for the reason explained in the fourth paragraph here, which is, the mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. Marley is dead. And we must understand this, or nothing wonderful can come of the story. So we have to know that Marley is dead, because it's Marley's death that makes Scrooge on his own. And it will be the visitation of Marley later on in this stave, later on in this chapter. The visitation of Marley is what will act as a catalyst for Scrooge to change, for him to transform, for him to redeem himself, for him to evolve into a better man. And potentially we could even tweak that to be that we can expect Scrooge to revert, to change back into the good man that he once was. So it requires Marley to be dead and the visitation of Marley's ghost that we'll see later on in this stave for Scrooge to begin to learn his lesson. Then what Dickens does in the rest of this particular chapter, in the rest of this paragraph, is just briefly explain using an allusion. An allusion is where a writer makes reference to something else. So you can have cultural allusions. If I make reference to Star Wars or Superman or something that's in the world right now. As I speak, TikTok videos seem to be a thing. Not by me, I hasten to add. If I were to make a religious allusion, I might refer to something in the Bible. Adam and Eve, something to do with Jesus. If I wanted to refer to the parting of the seas, I'd be making a reference to Moses, for instance. We then have historical allusions, referring to, if I said that Stalin was like Henry VIII, I'm making a historical allusion by comparing one historical figure to another historical figure. So it requires some knowledge. And perhaps the fourth and final kind is what we have here, which is a literary allusion. And in this instance, Dickens is making a literary allusion to Shakespeare's play Hamlet. And in Hamlet, what happens? The beginning of the text, we have Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark, on the stage when the ghost of his father emerges. And the ghost of his father emerging forces Hamlet into a sudden change in character, but in the case of Hamlet, it's a change which results in his tragic demise at the end of the text. It's not a good change. In this instance, Dickens makes reference to Hamlet so that we can see that change, evolution, redemption, transformation. It's on the way for Scrooge, but we don't yet know what type of transformation it is. And Scrooge, throughout the text, will be given the choice. So, Marley is dead, we're here, where the highlighted this is. This must be clearly understood, or nothing good, nothing wonderful can come of the story that we're going to be told. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, then it's just a man taking a stroll, in his castle. There'd be nothing strange about it. So here we have this reference to the ghost of Hamlet's father, because we are also going to have a reference to the visitation of a ghost. And the visitation of a ghost will force Scrooge to make a choice, just like Hamlet had to in his text. So while the first four paragraphs do not necessarily seem to be a huge amount about Scrooge, they're not, they're more about Marley. It's about establishing the concept and establishing the context, albeit briefly, for why Scrooge is the way he is, and providing a little bit of insight as to where the text is going to go. Alright, that's it. There are some questions that are going to come out of this as well. Hope this has been useful and interesting. And when the work comes your way, do try to do it. Thanks very much.